Okay, and so again, my name is Jolene Thomas. I am the Director of Graduate Studies for the Department of Religious Studies here at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm really thrilled to be, inviting all of you here and having you join us for this event. Speaking of events, before we get started with the task at hand, let me bring your attention to just a couple of things about our programming for the remainder of this term. First of all, for those of you who are in the Philadelphia area or nearby, I encourage you to always check out this page that I've just dropped into the chat, which is a list of our events. I mentioned a moment ago our departmental colloquium, which meets typically at this time on Thursday afternoons, and we bring in a number of speakers who talk about topics all related to religious studies broadly conceived. I also want to bring your attention to our annual, or mostly annual, Boardman Symposium, which will be coming up in a few weeks. There is a website that we've just recently put together, and the topic for this year's event is the Scholar of Religion in the Public Sphere. Registration is open. The Boardman Symposium this year will have both an in-person component and an online component. If you'd like to participate online, I would ask you to please email me and I'll get you the link. It's not quite up on the website yet, just technical difficulty, but we do encourage you to participate, whether virtually or in person. It promises to be a really exciting conversation about the risks, rewards, and responsibilities of public scholarship on religion. And I should make a point of mentioning that this is part of our ongoing celebrations of Department Chair Anthea Butler's receipt of the 2022 Martin E. Marty Award and the Public Understanding of Religion. Those are a couple of, both our ongoing stream of events and then one of our main annual events that will be coming up very soon. And I encourage you to look at those websites and to familiarize yourself with the things that we'll be doing in the coming weeks. But let me turn now to the task at hand. We are here to celebrate Assistant Professor Reyhan Durmaz's brand new book, Stories Between Christianity and Islam. And as has been our recent departmental tradition, we're doing this in a webinar format so that we can bring a lot of people from around the world together to talk about this. And indeed, the people you can see on your screens are actually in very different time zones and on 3 different continents. So this is truly a global event. And I think that's because we're talking about a book of equally global proportions. So allow me to introduce our speakers for today. We're going to have the author of our text present the work, and we will have a response. I'm going to introduce our respondent first and then our author. So our respondent is Dr. Barbara Rochema, who is a Dutch scholar. She teaches history of the Muslim world at the University of Florence in Italy. She studied Arabic and Syriac in Groningen, Oxford, Birmingham, and Cairo, and has a PhD from the University of Groningen, the Netherlands, from the year 2007. She is a specialist in interreligious encounters in the Islamicate world. Her research focuses on contacts between Muslims, Jews, and Christians between the 7th and 14th centuries, as reflected in historiography, hagiography, and polemical writings. She participated in several large research projects, among which the ERC project, Defining Belief and Identities in the Eastern Mediterranean, the Role of Interreligious Debate and Interaction at King's College London, and the ERC project, Jews and Christians in the East, Strategies of Interaction Between the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean, at the Center for Religious Studies of the Ruhr University Bochum in Germany. She is co-editor of Christian-Muslim Relations, a Bibliographical History, Volume 1, 600 to 900, that was co-edited with David Thomas, came out from Brill in 2009, and also the co-editor of Patristic Literature in Arabic Translations, co-edited with Alexander Traeger, which came out from Brill in 2019. Her dissertation, The Legend of Sergius Bahira, Eastern Christian Apologetics and Apocalyptic in Response to Islam, came out with Brill in 2009, deals with some of the same questions as Reyhan's book, notably the exchange of hagiographical tales between Muslims and Arabic and Syriac-speaking Christians during the early Islamic period. So clearly, our respondent knows a lot about the subject at hand today, and she is responding to a book by our own Reyhan Durmaz. Reyhan Durmaz's research interests include Syriac Christianity, religion and society in late antiquity, hagiography, and Christian-Muslim relations in the Middle Ages. Her first monograph is what we're going to be hearing about today, briefly, it examines the transmission of non-biblical saints' stories and cults from Christianity to Islam. Her other research projects include study of rural Christianities in the Middle Ages in the Eastern Mediterranean and religious skepticism in the medieval Middle East. She received her PhD from Brown University in 2019 with a Dukowski Outstanding Dissertation Award in Humanities. She was a junior fellow in Byzantine studies at the Dumbarton Oaks Research Library and Collection in 2018 to 19. She's also been supported by the Woodrow Wilson Foundation. She has recently been a faculty fellow at our local Wolf Humanities Center, where she started working on the first Arabic newspaper published in the United States, Kaukab America, analyzing the ways that the Syrian immigrant community articulated religion and religious diversity in 19th century New York City. She also organized our last Boardman symposium. In this case, it was a pandemic era online series on the subject of destabilizing religion in the medieval Middle East, which is related to her own research interest in skepticism. That series examined the categories of religion and non-religion in the context of the medieval Middle East. She is the co-chair of the Philadelphia Seminar on Christian Origins, and she is currently faculty research fellow at Fordham University's Orthodox Christian Studies Center in this academic year. During this fellowship, she is researching forms and expressions of Christianity in the medieval Middle Eastern countryside, and she actually has this really fabulous website, which I'm putting into the chat right now, which has these wonderful maps, story maps, ArcGIS story maps and images. I was just poking around on it a little bit earlier, and I encourage you to do the same. Our protocol for today is that we're going to hear from Reyhan first. She's going to tell us about the book, and then we'll have a response. There may be a little bit of time for some back and forth between our two speakers before we open it up to Q&A. And if you have questions, I encourage you to use the Q&A function, and I will call on you, and I will be able to sort of promote you so that you'll be able to ask your question out loud when we get to that point. For now, I'll turn things over to you, Reyhan. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Thomas, for the introduction and for organizing this launch. And I would like to extend my thanks to Professor Rogema for accepting our invitation to be the respondent in this conversation. I'm so honored and excited to have you with us. And my thanks also go to my department colleagues, our department administrator, and our graduate students who have all been very helpful and supportive in the process of writing, publishing, and celebrating this book with me. I will say a few words about the contours of the book and the main questions in it, then we'll leave the virtual floor to Professor Rogema. So my earliest childhood memories are from Edessa, Şanlıurfa in southeast Turkey. I remember going to Abraham's pool, the site believed to be where the prophet Abraham was thrown to fire by idol worshippers. And more than the buildings or the pool, I remember the rule. You couldn't eat the fish in the pool or harm them in any way. They were sacred. Because the logs of wood the pagans collected to set Abraham on fire miraculously transformed into those very fish. This holy water and the sacred fish are a big source of pride for the city. And it, of course, connects the history of the prophets to our own time. You will hear the story if you visit the pool today. It is reiterated in multiple sources, including the website of the Şanlıurfa municipality. The 4th century pilgrim Egeria visited this pool, ate from the fish, and she found it to be very tasty. Egeria visited various sites around Edessa commemorating Abraham's prophecy, but her diary does not mention this pool being connected to the story of Abraham. So the stories different communities told changed the sacred landscape of the city over the centuries. And I'm so proud and excited to be a part of that city's history and witnessing that city's history. My book is an exploration of the medium of story that connects and separates layers of history. Storytelling is, of course, arguably the most human practice we all engage in to create meaning, and it's an incremental practice. We tell stories building on prior stories to make ourselves legible, and the COVID-19 pandemic is a great example to this. In the early days of the pandemic, you will remember that many people turned to the scriptures to interpret our moment with stories of apocalyptic prophecy or those of hope and resilience. In addition to biblical stories, historical accounts of the Black Death and the novelistic descriptions of imagined pandemics made our rich storyscape in the past 3 years. Even if you do not find these stories meaningful yourself, if you wanted to understand and participate in those broader conversations about the pandemic, you must build a certain level of story literacy, from biblical plays to Camus' The Plague. So our story of the pandemic builds on, again, on a foundation of previous stories. To account for this play of continuity and innovation in the transmission of stories across generational, geographical, and linguistic boundaries, scholars, journalists, artists, politicians, everyone refer to shared stories. But what does it mean to share stories? Especially when new retellings of those stories are directed toward new audiences under new circumstances. I try to answer this question in my book through the lens of Christian and Muslim communities in late antiquity and the Middle Ages, which is roughly from the 4th to the 14th century. My starting question in the beginning of this project, which is about 8 years ago now, was how and why were some stories transmitted between Christianity and Islam in the early Middle Ages while others were not? Traveling stories is, of course, an old question on which there is voluminous scholarship. Studies on ancient mythology, the Homeric epic, the scriptures, medieval literature, and modern media have all developed various theoretical frames for conceptualizing storytelling and shared stories. And the suggestions fall on what I prefer to call a spectrum of transmission. On the one end of the spectrum, there is the shared tropes in the air with minimal interpersonal agency and interaction. And on the other end is the shared stories. This was one of the problems I wanted to address in this book. So let me say a few more words about this spectrum. When it comes to shared stories between Christianity and Islam, some scholars argue that most stories, in fact, draw from a common pool of tropes. A fierce leader, a relentless traveler, an unlearned yet wise sage, a believer pious to death, are all well-known literary building blocks with which different groups build their own stories. And cultural encounter and exchange, the argument goes, is difficult to identify when there is such a common pool of shared types, symbols, and expressions in between. Christian and Islamic stories that sound similar have been partly explained with this shared tropes in the air argument. It is, of course, useful to be aware of these broadly circulating tropes, but the works that propose this argument often overlook important agencies and modes of creativity. This is one end of the spectrum of transmission. At the other end is the direct transmission of full stories from point A to point B. Many scholars of the Quran and other Islamic literature use source criticism to identify the texts that potentially underlie the specific stories in Islamic literature. They tend to turn to Apocrypha, homilies, and other literature to find the origins or sources of those Islamic stories. One of the downsides of this type of analysis is that it assesses texts in relation to their subtexts, and it rarely considers the continued engagement of communities with that transmitted material. In my book, I speak about the broad gray zone between these two ends, namely the passive sharing of common tropes versus active, intentional transfer of full stories. One of my main arguments is that most hagiographic transfers between Christianity and Islam happened between these 2 points at the level of persona. In other words, when we speak about shared stories, we are most of the time speaking about certain personalities whose stories are written anew in Islam and Christianity. Considering that the majority of the population did not have access to manuscripts in the Middle Ages, speaking about shared personas proved to be more useful to me than shared stories or text. So I focused on the dynamics of oral storytelling, especially in the first part of the book. The book is therefore dedicated to exploring the agents and contexts of transmission, the creativity in retellings of stories, the complicated notion of authorship when Christian and Muslim authors write separate stories for shared characters, and what this all means in terms of cultural memory. So I would like to briefly walk you through what the book does. I begin with a discussion of the practice of orally narrating saint stories in late antique Christianity. The main argument in the first chapter is that Christians in late antiquity, men and women, monks, clerics, and lay people strove to develop a certain degree of literacy in narratives about prophets and saints. And this form of skill or literacy was an important social currency that destabilized the binary of simple versus educated believers. I then bring Muhammad and the early Islamic community into the picture, taking the Quran as a process, as a polished transcript of a communication between a preacher and his community in late antiquity. I reconstruct Muhammad as a narrator and interpreter of saints' stories. With this, I join the conversation about how to study early Islam as a product and participant of late antiquity. Muhammad's preaching of monotheism in Arabia is often taken to be the pivotal point at which pagan Arabia became a thing of late antiquity. I argue against this heightened emphasis on Muhammad's agency and show the ways in which his narrations of stories were contextualized, debated, and sometimes, of course, refuted by his audiences against the backdrop of the scriptural universe of late antiquity. In the second half of the book, I move from late antiquity to the Middle Ages and explore the ways stories of Christian holy men were oriented toward various meanings in Islamic literature. So this marks a chronological and methodological shift between the earlier and later parts of the book. In chapter 3, I focus on a Quran chapter, Surat al-Kahf, the cave, and its interpretation. This Quran chapter includes 5 very interesting and interrelated narratives. They're all well studied separately from each other, but I analyze them together. In the Quran, the stories do not sound like stories from Judaism or Christianity particularly. They are quite generic. But when we look at the later Islamic interpretations, they are mostly narrated as Christian stories. So I show that the more Muslims learned about Christian hagiography, the more these generic Quranic stories became Christian in Muslim imagination. In chapters 4 and 5, I step outside the Quran and I analyze stories of Christian holy men in a variety of Islamic literature, all fulfilling different literary roles. With 5 case studies, I demonstrate how the balance of Christian saints in Islam was continuously re-articulated and negotiated. Christian saints and their stories were mostly used for these 5 purposes. 1, saints were presented as members of the Muslim community. 2, hagiographic stories were used for historical information, or often as etiologies explaining Islamic practices and beliefs. 3, stories were used to praise cities or regions, and saints became excellences of those locations. 4, Christian saints were presented as examples and embodiments of universal piety and wisdom, their Christian background being erased. And finally, stories were used for exegesis of the Quran. This is, of course, not an exhaustive list. We can name other functions that Christian saint stories fulfill in Islamic literature, but most stories I analyzed fell under these categories. And in the final chapter of the book, I conclude by bringing together some repeating themes in the previous analyses, such as the role of the family in the preservation and dissemination of knowledge pertaining to the divine path. So my hope is that the readers leave stories between Christianity and Islam with these 4 takeaways. First of all, categories such as Christian versus Islamic stories, prophets versus saints, biblical versus non-biblical stories become blurry when we consider ubiquitous practices like storytelling. Identification of stories as Christian or Islamic, as biblical, apocryphal, historiographical, or otherwise were not inherent, but contextual qualities. 2, the simple versus educated or theologically knowledgeable believers is another false dichotomy, and that's another one of the main takeaways that I hope I clarified in the book. The knowledge and narrations of stories complicates the notion of the simple layperson and destabilizes the authority of clerics and theologians. 3, as I mentioned above, rather than full stories or mere tropes, we must pay attention to transformations of personas between Christianity and Islam, and actually between any confessional boundary, and develop appropriate methodologies to do that. And finally, Christian-Muslim encounters were not one-time interactions, but were continuums of conversation. And the many transformations of saints in medieval literature witness that continuous making and erasing of memories of the divine past. Of course, covering such a broad topic, stories between Christianity and Islam has inevitable shortcomings. For example, in an earlier draft, I had a discussion of the role of material culture in transmissions of saint stories, but I eventually left it out. A rigorous analysis of inscriptions, architectural sculpture and decorations, small objects and textiles in terms of their role as catalyzers of hagiographic transmissions would be a great complement to this book. As an homage to this important aspect of the topic, I will end my notes with the story of choosing a cover image for the book, which Professor Thomas showed a couple minutes earlier. So firstly, I did not want an image of Mary or Jesus on the cover, because most of the time when scholars speak about shared stories between Christianity and Islam, we speak about stories of Mary, Jesus, and other biblical characters and events. And I did not want to reinforce that tendency. After considering a few wall paintings, manuscript illuminations, and small objects, I decided to use Kandinsky's painting titled Saint George. This abstract painting perfectly captures the ongoing transformation of this holy man across time and place. An equestrian man slaying a dragon may be a recognizable story for many people. Especially given the title, the painting becomes legible as the representation of the well-known story of Saint George. But in this painting, the saint himself fades into the background, while the fierce horse and the defeated dragon become the main characters of this scene. And I really like about this. I like that about this painting. And the different colored brush strokes add many semi-articulated details to the story. This vague but lively representation is an important moment of interpretation in the history of the veneration of Saint George. And similarly, my book hopefully brings to the fore a variety of those moments of creative interpretation in the centuries-long commemoration of the divine past shared by Christians and Muslims. I will stop here, and I very much look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you so much. Dr. Rohima, the floor is yours.
Okay, is the volume good? Yep, okay. To understand the transition in the Middle East from a largely Christian culture in the 7th century to a thriving Islamic caliphate by the 9th century is a fascinating but notoriously complex research issue. It takes enormous efforts of scholars from many disciplines to get a more precise understanding of this large historical process of transition from late antiquity to Islam. If we look at the status questiones of this issue, we see contributors from numerous disciplines who each look at this issue from different angles. The principal disciplines are late antique history, Arabic studies, Islamic studies, Byzantine studies, archaeology. But to these one could also add art history, Christian theology, Islamic theology, Judaic studies, Syriac studies, Persianate studies, numismatics, papyrology, patristics, etc. Everyone adds to these questions in different ways. While an archaeologist may ask what the near perfect survival of mosaics in southern Jordan may tell us about the evolving attitude of Muslims towards Christian religious imagery of live beings, a Judaic scholar may ask what the strong anti-Christian language in a Jewish apocalypse from the 7th century may confirm with regard to the hypothesis that Jews regarded Muslims as liberators. A Syriac scholar may draw attention to a late 7th century source which praises the Hagarenes for protecting monasteries, while right at the same moment, a Byzantinist focuses on a Greek homily in which the author actually laments the destruction of monasteries at the hands of invading conquerors. As complex as this part of the world was during the time, equally complex is the new world that we have created in scholarship, in which a polyphony of different approaches yields different and at times conflicting interpretations of the historical evolution from late antiquity through early Islam to classical Islam. It is our generation that is harvesting all the fruits of the last, I'd say, 50 years of research, but we also toil with the many findings that have been proposed and which often seem to stand in tension with each other. In very general terms, one might say that the biggest question we are working on is the one of continuity versus change. Did Islam suddenly erupt as a new religion and society in a world that was very different from it? Or should we focus more on continuities and gradual changes? I think we mostly tend to that second possibility these days, however difficult it might be. Before going more deeply into Reyhan's work, I would just like to say how important it is for scholars to combine the various disciplines as a way to refine our views on early Islam. This is a point that needs to be made first and foremost. Only a deep knowledge of Syriac and Arabic-speaking Christianity, as well as of early Islam, can promise progress in the field. And it is wonderful to find to focus on the multidisciplinary character of Reyhan's book. It is such a commonplace in a way to speak of multidisciplinarity, but as we see here, it's also crucial. The readers who will pick up the book because it has such an attractive title and such a beautiful cover, and seeing that it is so beautifully produced, will perhaps be a little bit intimidated when they realize it is very, very dense reading indeed. Stories sounds very nice and entertaining, but the non-expert reader will soon realize that the stories that feature in this book are not considered fiction in the modern sense of the word, and they do not even have such a label. As Reyhan shows very clearly, although I lack the page number here, but she says very clearly that these are all texts which in their original were called narrations, biographies, the true history of, etc. These texts are all vehicles of ideas about holiness, ideas about morality, about the visible signs of the divine in our ordinary world, and God's support for the pious. They are all loaded with meaning, and they can be the basis for the actual foundation of a monastery or a church in memory of such a saintly figure. Or in turn, the presence of a holy site can stimulate further narrations of the feats of a holy man or woman and inspire new miracles and imaginations which nurture the sense of communal identity that keeps competing religious communities out. It is quite a task to unravel the histories of holiness within the Christian churches of the Near East, each story being appropriated in new regions and reshaped according to the needs of believers. But when one sees how these stories also inspired re-narrations amongst Muslims in the Islamic world, things become just a little bit more complicated. Models of holiness are taken up by the new community and find expression in new types of texts and social settings. The ways in which this happens has been the subject of extensive research that often requires painstaking investigation of manuscripts, textual traditions. It involves the production of critical editions, annotated translations by multiple scholars. A prime example, I think, would be the Alexander legend, which has a widespread transmission in the medieval Christian and Muslim world, and is known in many interrelated versions. This is a text which is also treated in chapters 3 and 4 of Reyhan's book. You will find it there. Scholarship on this text goes back more than a century. Actually, I wrote century and a half here. I would have to look that up. There are a handful of scholars actually who have dedicated practically their entire career to this one particular legend. When texts are so rich in meaning and apparently so relevant to the many communities that included it in their canon, one easily gets lost in endless tricky details, such as the corruption of names, the contamination of various versions, and especially the question of intentionality of textual changes versus general textual corruption. Even to simply work through the bibliography of each of these texts is a huge task. It is hard not to drown in such work and instead to take distance and begin comparative analysis that includes other equally dynamic texts. So this is where we have to admire Reyhan. She has managed not to get swept away by the sheer amount of work and unanswered questions about each individual text that she discusses. Instead, she has taken it upon herself to investigate several examples of well-known and widespread stories and try to see to what extent they have followed similar trajectories within and outside their original communities. But as you know, it's not a book about textual transmission per se. It is a study of how the phenomenon of cultural transmission, it is a study of how the phenomenon of cultural transmission with a strong emphasis on the implications of orality and performance and on the prestige of storytelling and the display of historical knowledge in the Quranic milieu in the early Islamic period. Her book makes it clear that these stories need to be included in the larger question of the transition from late antiquity to classical Islam. At the same time, she also shows how hard this can be. Simple models of original source versus its nachleben, or original versus later appropriation, Christian versus Islamic, etc., all turn out to be insufficient and unhelpful to grasp the complexity of storytelling in the Muslim world. Rather than seeing this as a defeat, I would say that the main achievement of this book is to call such simple schematization into question. It does so by showing that in the early Muslim world, there were numerous social settings in which people exchanged stories without there being clear boundaries between the communities. Often it is thought that Christian and Jewish sources were fully fixed in their canon, in their final versions, and pulled out to shed light on elusive tales in the Quran. This is too simplistic because it does not take into account that Christians were consulted to shed light on Quranic stories after the Quran as well, and that exchanges took place in both directions. A clear example that illustrates this is the story of the 7 sleepers of Ephesus, or the Ahl Kahf in the Quran. In both specific manuscripts, of the Christian Ethiopic tradition and the Christian Arabic tradition, there are narrative details which otherwise are only to be found in the Islamic tradition. In other words, channels of communication were open in both directions for centuries. Now, it will be very nice to open up the floor to discussion, since I'm very eager to hear what the impressions are of other readers. and what questions they may have. But before that, I would like to just take out one example, which it's just a choice. Of course, there's many interesting examples, but I chose the example of Saint Anthony, the well-known early Christian hermit saint, who also features in a book by Ibn Abi Dunya, a 9th century Muslim author. I think it's interesting also for who hasn't read the book yet, maybe it will make you curious. I chose this example actually because I know least about it. So I was also very curious about it. Later, I have to ask Reyhan what her favorite example is, of course. Saint Anthony of Egypt was well known to Christians in the whole Middle East as one of the founders of asceticism and a very clear, strong model of piety. His life, as written by Athanasius of Alexandria, circulated widely in many, let's say all, Christian communities and was shortened and expanded upon numerous times. One might not be surprised, therefore, to encounter him also in Islamic literature. But what Reyhan shows is that he reappears in a work entitled The Fear of God and Confidence Indeed of Ibn Abi Dunya. He was a scholar who was active in Baghdad in the 9th century as a scholar, moralist, and tutor. He presents a conversation between a group of dignitaries and a certain Anthony. Anthony is present as a wise old man who speaks in parables, and he exhorts his audience to reflect on human frailty, the reality of the afterlife, and the need for moderation in one's life. The Christian model of Anthony is clearly recognizable here, yet at the same time, there is no textual connection between this text of Ibn Abi Dunya and the traditional life of Anthony as it circulated amongst Christians. Perhaps there is a looser connection to the well-known Apophthegmata Patrum, the sayings of the Desert Fathers, full of parables as well. So how did Ibn Abi Dunya become acquainted with the figure of Saint Anthony? He was active at the Abbasid court, and he undoubtedly interacted with Christians there who formed the majority of the translators during the Greco-Arabic translation movement. Yet a direct link between a text of theirs and Ibn Abi Dunya is not to be found. This is not presented by Reyhan as a negative result of her research, so to say, but as an indication of what she calls the heteroglossia of the marketplace, and Ibn Abi Dunya's broad literary horizon beyond Islamic material, and the extent of which medieval Christian literature is preserved in Islam. We have to imagine a wider world around Ibn Abi Dunya from which he received or tapped his inspiration. In the same way, we might summarize other parts of the book, and it uncovers similar processes of interaction, but I'm not going to give more examples. I would like to congratulate Reyhan on her wonderful achievement, and I just hope that this discussion that we're going to have will inspire many people to actually pick up the book and spread the news.
Thank you so much. I'll give Professor Durmaz an opportunity to respond. And for those of you who are in the audience, you can go ahead and queue up whatever questions you may have. There is a Q&A box, and we'll soon open up the floor for a more general discussion. But first, Reyhan, do you have anything that you'd like to say?
I would like to thank you so much, Professor Rogema. It's a great honor to hear your thoughts on this book. I, of course, used extensively your work and other scholars' work that just paved the way for me. So I'm extremely beyond thankful. And I agree that the Anthony example is a great one. I enjoyed writing and thinking about that case very much, and you're right that our approach to these stories just changed the frames with which we analyze them. It was previously analyzed by one more scholar, as far as I know, in the 1950s, and the story was somewhat dismissed as pseudepigrapha and just a weird, awkward story that a Muslim author just made up. But I wanted to show how Muslim Antony became in this, and how it's a great example of a literary piece from 9th century Baghdad that can tell us so much about cultural interaction, because the fact that he is presented as Christian, as the very well-known Saint Anthony of Egypt, but at the same time quoting from the Quran and appearing side by side with Muslim saints in this text, I think means a lot in terms of those interreligious interaction and communication and knowledge transmission between Christianity and Islam. So thank you so much for highlighting that example. I enjoy that case study very much. So yeah, I would like to not take up too much time, and if anybody else has any other comments, questions, or pushback, you are most welcome.
So I'll chime in here, and I see that we are starting to get some questions in. As people are thinking of their questions, I'll just throw one out with my sort of moderator's privilege, because your description of the book, Reyhan, verbally just now, I think you were translating some of this stuff for this audience compared to the way you presented it in text. And one of the things that leapt out to me was your very clear explication of how you were not interested in tropes or the transmission of whole stories, but this category of personas. So here's a very simple question for you. Why is personas not in the title? Like, what it seemed you presented that as being so central to what you were trying to do here for all of us. And then I guess one other related thing is you make a big point in the last chapter to talk about the importance of families. And I wanted to just give you an opportunity to expand on that point, because I think it was something that you didn't quite include in your opening remarks.
Yeah, thank you so much for these questions. And for some of you in the audience know what a saga it was to come up with the title of this book. We didn't want to include hagiography because it was too technical, and then it was a discussion between myself and my colleagues who know the material, the press, who were more worried about the face of the book rather than the accurate capturing of the content. So you're absolutely right that persona or even narrative literacy could have actually been good additions to the title in terms of capturing its content, but I didn't want to, I think, scare the broader audiences who would like to maybe learn about late antiquity or early Islam, but would maybe be taken aback by those terms. So it was a tactical choice, but I would have loved to have personas in the title. And the family is a big question, and I think it deserves a book in and of itself. There are a couple articles, and I think there's some one or two edited volumes recently out that that study the family in the medieval Middle East. But I would love to see more scholarship on that. I could only briefly touch upon that phenomenon of family or various families, previously Christian or not, and their role in the transmission of knowledge of biblical stories, biblical books, and how they cultivate a certain level of prestige through their knowledge of the Bible or scriptural stories, however we may want to phrase that. So that's, again, I hope raises enough curiosity in other people to just pursue that scholarship, because I think it's a very important aspect of transmission. We tend to think about scholars and manuscripts and scriptoria and monastic libraries or individuals, but between the individual and the institution, I think there lies the family, which was an extremely important agent in transmissions in the medieval Middle East.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your answer on both points. So we have our first question from the audience, which is from Gregory. And I wanted to give, I can read the question aloud, but Gregory, if you would like to ask the question yourself, I can promote you and allow you to go ahead and ask it yourself. So Gregory, I will see if you're ready to speak publicly, and if not, I'll read your question aloud. Just in case that's taking a moment.
I think he might have left.
Oh, here we are. Okay. Gregory, are you with us? Okay, I'll read the question aloud just in case, and if Gregory can join, then that would be great. So he says, thank you very much for a fascinating, oh, here he is.
Yeah, sorry for the internet issues. And so first of all, thank you very much, Professor Durmaz, for a fascinating presentation. My question was about you're speaking and using the phrase shared stories between a Christian and Muslim. I was wondering, do you have any thoughts or any suggestions just briefly about whether we can talk about how the shared stories can generate a shared space between the Christian and Muslim, especially in the Middle East.
Yeah, thank you so much.
And what kind of a spaces, what kind of things that they can promote in any thoughts? Thank you.
Thank you so much. As I mentioned towards the end, I had to cut out the shared spaces and other material aspects of shared stories from the book, about which I'm really sad. But you're absolutely right that we need to be talking about and thinking about the shared spaces where stories were shared. And the first things, of course, come to mind are shrines, monasteries, and the marketplace, you name it. When we talk about the medieval Middle East, we are talking about various forms of shared spaces. And for that, I will direct the audience to the works of Barbara Rogema and other scholars and of the Middle East who have been studying the shared spaces and what that means in terms of cultural interaction, because the research is still developing in that front as well. We know that Muslims, Christians, and other religious groups shared spaces, but we don't know what that entails on an everyday basis. We still have to articulate religious boundaries or lack of it in those spaces. So you're absolutely right that to be able to talk about shared stories or any shared notions or shared beliefs or unshared ones, we need to conceptualize the actual logistics of it, which space is the first place to begin. So thank you so much for pointing our attention to the materialities of those transmissions. And thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, we have room for other questions, plenty of time. Would anybody like to chime in with a question of your own?
I wouldn't mind responding, but I talked so much already. But
no, please go ahead.
There's nobody at this very moment.
I also have questions, but please go. We want to hear from you.
One question I have was about family, but then you already asked that because it's an intriguing aspect of it. But yeah, the second question I have, I think fits more with what Gregory was just asking. I completely agree that many of the stories that you discuss, and maybe some other ones that are not in the book, are the result of a milieu in which people have common imaginations, a shared like spiritual imagination and things like that, and interactions across the communities through a longer time than just in the Quranic milieu. I think you make that very clear. But in my own research, I focused a lot on stories that have a polemical intent and that seem to be even though they come from a common reservoir of ideas and a narrative topoi or ideas about who's holy and who's special, all of this is shared. But then the end product that comes out is a story that's actually not open to others. It's a story that's closed and that's not supposed to be of value to another community because it's saying something negative, implying something negative about another community. So of course there's many of these that circulate in the Middle East as well. I was wondering whether among the stories that you've studied, you find examples of texts where you thought these, even though they have a common basis, in the end they also clearly have a polemical aspect to them, or did you choose the stories in such a way that you didn't include anything that is very much working on boundaries rather than on kind of shared ideas?
Right. Thank you so much. That's one of the things that I should have added now in retrospect to the functions of Christian hagiographic stories play in Islamic literature. Polemics should have been there. That is my own self-critique, because you're right that many stories directly or indirectly engage with Christian saint stories in a polemical way, or use them to defeat Christian theological notions. Many of the stories about Mary, for example, are of course used in theological debates about the sanctity and holiness and divine nature of Mary, or the lack of that nature. So you're absolutely right that stories have that function, none of the stories I have in the book directly have that, but even in examples like Anthony, the way he becomes Muslim by the end of that text is a certain indirect way of engaging with Christian hagiography and erasing that memory for Muslim audiences. I don't know, I can't tell, or rather I shouldn't just assume that that text was known by Christians, but I still imagine that many Muslims in the audience, or who have had access to that story, knew the Christian version of the story as well. So I'm willing to entertain that possibility of Muslims comparing the Christian versions to the Muslim versions, Islamic versions of the story, and seeing the memory erasure that is at hand, especially in that text. Another one is the story of Saint Maruta as narrated by Ibn al-Azraq. And in that text too, he clearly, explicitly says, I took this Syriac text to someone and that person started to translate the text for me, but I didn't like that translation, so I took it to another person. So he was picking and choosing what translation of the text he should use. And in the end, he uses the life of Maruta to narrate the history of Meyfarkat, but in a way that Maruta becomes a local a local hero rather than a Christian bishop. So the clerical titles are erased. The Christianness of the story is very much muted down, and it becomes a story of a local hero. So in those ways, of course, there's an erasure of Christian memory to make new memories for Muslim and Islamic versions of those saints. So I see debate and polemic and conflict in between the lines, but none of the texts that I have are directly engaging in polemics through storytelling, which is admittedly one of the missing parts of the book.
No, I wouldn't say it's missing. I was just wondering whether you read certain of these texts in this way, but you explained it very clear. I agree with you that some of these attempts to appropriate a person from Christianity at the very beginning may clearly have the intention to then reshape that figure, like wiping out the Christian elements, kind of neutralizing that earlier faith. But then once it's in the community, I don't think that people would have been given it much thought. But it's just guessing, of course. As you say, we don't know what background the listeners had to for example, Ibn Abi Dunya, but it wouldn't surprise me, since people were convinced that most of these early believers in the Middle East were not really Trinitarian Christians, but more like believers in a general sense. It would be completely normal to then narrate a story, just like the stories of Jesus, for example, the ones that have been collected by Tarif Khalidi about the sayings of Jesus, as you find them across lots of ascetical writings. It's just the Jesus as he was imagined by Muslims. He was not a part of a Trinity or anything, but he's still a holy figure for Muslims. So there's no outright polemics there. It's
Right.
just a reshaping of Jesus.
Right. No, thank you so much for saying that, because that's one of the main arguments, or at least highlights, other people argued this before me, that when Muslim authors were picking and shaping the stories, I don't see any sign that they picked a Christian story and made it Islamic. They were talking about the same divine path. So you're absolutely right. And thank you again for highlighting that Islamic or Christian stories and Christian saints and figures becoming Muslim is too drastic of a process that we imagine, that I don't see any sign for on the ground. So the confessional boundaries were much more blurry than we imagine in these transmissions. Thank you again for highlighting that.
Okay, so it's good we agree on these things. For
100%.
example, the stories about Najran, there's such a clear example. I mean, the martyrs of Najran, the whole process, it was imagined as a struggle between right and wrong, about a story of persecution, and it was not so much about who's Christian, who's Jewish.
Right, 100%.
It's more like an allegory at some point.
We have a related question from Dr. Steve Weitzman. He's put it in the chat, but I've just asked him to join us as a panelist so he can ask it to you directly.
First of all, Professor Durmaz, thank you so much for the great contribution to our understanding of the multicultural Middle East in this period. I guess I'm interested in how were Christians and Muslims exclusively focused on one another's stories in this period? I know the Jews were absorbing these stories as well, but I'm interested in kind of who was paying attention to who, and is this kind of dynamic that you're describing a kind of dyadic exchange, or is it more kind of multicultural?
That's another one of the apology footnotes of this book, Steve, that I remember from the earlier phases of this project, you asking me like, where are the Jews? And I admittedly and lamentably could not engage with that literature. But of course, I hope it is clear that I do not mean to isolate Christian and Muslim dialogue and in exclusion of Jews. I think many of these stories have been just consumed and rewritten as stories of the biblical past, Christian, Muslim, or Jewish, or like without those labels. And one of the best witnesses of that is the Quran chapter that I analyzed in chapter 3, and one of the stories there is. Many of the stories there have been interpreted as Christian stories by later Islamic exegetes, but one of the stories, the parable of the rich man and the poor man, which you and I were talking about a couple of weeks ago, that have been interpreted as a story from the Jewish community. So that only testifies to the ongoing conversations between, of course, like Muslims and Jews, and how their stories have also made to Quranic interpretation and other forms of Islamic literature. So I took Christian-Muslim interaction only as an example to gesture towards a much broader and much diverse literary and storytelling interaction between communities.
So thank you. I just wanted to clarify. So it's not the case that Christianity and Islam were so established by this point that they only had to be concerned with one another's stories. There's a larger picture.
Exactly. That's exactly. No, thank you for rephrasing. That's not at all what I am trying to say. I don't think Christianity and Islam stand out as the two established religions of the time period in dialogue with each other. I think Islam, we can't even speak about Islam with a capital I for a very long time after Muhammad's career, and Christianity is the easiest way to talk about the Christian diversity in the Middle East. So I didn't mean to single those two out as very well established entities in dialogue with each other, but to just two participants in a broader multi-confessional space. Sorry, there's some echo, so I'm
I think it's good now. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here, and I hope we can continue talking about all of these stories.
Of course.
Our next question comes from Dr. Megan Robb, who is joining us momentarily.
Sorry for the like, can you hear me? Yes? Okay, hi.
Yes.
Professor Durmaz, first of all, I just want to congratulate you. Oh, I hope everything's disappeared. I'm sorry. You can still.
We can
We see
we
you.
can see you. You're just sideways.
Okay, well, I can't see anyone, but I'm so happy you can see me, so I'll continue. I don't want to hold things up. Professor Durmaz, I just want to congratulate you, first of all, on a beautiful book, both inside and out. I really am enjoying reading through it. I remember looking at early drafts of some of the chapters, several years ago now, and then the draft of the book. And I've really enjoyed thinking about the concepts over the years. So as you know, I'm a modern historian of religion and I work on Salvation Islam, but I work a lot with at the nexus of one of the themes that I think is important in your book, the intersection of orality and textual material, challenging this sense of a neat binary between speech and text that you talk about, I think, in the really early on in the book. And, one of the issues that as a more modern historian that I work with is countering that conception of between text and orality as well. But I see it manifesting in a really different way in the conversation partners that you're engaging with. So this may be an unfair question to ask of a scholar of antiquity. So tell me if this is just completely off base. But I wonder if you could reflect a little bit on how you see this aspect of your work, that challenging of the dichotomy between speech and text, how it potentially relates to historiographical conversations even beyond antiquity about the elevation of text over orality, or the concern to fix texts and critical editions as a way of kind of capturing religion in this world religions model where a religion is defined by text. I just love you to kind of zoom out a little bit, and at least to me, that the relevance is so clear, and I think it really speaks to those conversations, and I'd love to hear you think out loud about that.
Thank you so much for being here and asking an excellent question that had been in my mind for since the beginning of this project, basically, because I opened with that question, right? Like, how can we destabilize the text-based understanding of religious practice, theology, debate, and religion in general? And I tried to tackle with it as clear as possible without getting into too much technical details. In the dissertation version of this, I have all of those theories and terms, and it was very tiring to read. So I tried to simplify it as much as possible, but it's still one of the major concerns of the book, and I hope one of the major questions it raises, and one of the most exciting arguments, which is to just destabilize that a little and move away from texts. But of course the problem is that moving away from text can only happen through text. So I try to trace the so-called residues of morality in some of the stories that I analyzed, and I advocated for taking serious some of the content where people describe a gathering, where people tell stories in this and that way. When they describe those things in those gatherings and those oral transmissions of stories, I with a grain of salt, I wanted to take that serious, and I wanted to take those stories serious and read them cumulatively to look into that oral narrations of stories. So you're absolutely right that this is an ongoing question, and it doesn't at all pertain only to antiquity, but even today we have a very, of course, understandably a more text-based understanding, and the same the I think argument when I started this project was that antiquity is all oral, and we cannot trace that. There was a play between text and orality, but we cannot capture. It was an oral culture anyway. So all of these essentialist approaches shaped the way we read texts, and I'm of course a product of those approaches as well. And I wanted to challenge that by trying to see how we can reconstruct orality without negating the fact that many of the orality was still tied to textualities in quite intricate ways. This is me thinking out loud, and I don't have a solution or a clear answer. But no clear answer, no solution to the problem, but absolutely acknowledging the fact that there is still much work to do for religion in the pre-modern as well as the modern period when it comes to detangling orality from a text-based understanding of religion.
Thank you so much for reflecting out loud. That was really generous.
Thank you so much. Our next question asker is Professor Jamal Elias, who will be joining us momentarily.
Hello, and again, I want to join everyone else who's spoken so far in congratulating Dr. Durmaz on such a fantastic book. It's such a, an important and very intelligent book, and also Dr. Rugema for her really, really insightful comments. My question actually is, again, I'm hoping you can reflect out loud on something you alluded to today, and I know this from other places. And you said that, no hagiography in the title because the word is too technical. But I also know that you actually think in very, very innovative and sophisticated ways about the issue of hagiography. So could you reflect on, well, again, beyond are there problems with using the term hagiography within the context of the work that you're doing in this context?
Thank you so much, Jamal, for the question. And that's, that you and I have been talking about this, and, from the earlier phases of this project, that was one of the catchphrases or the problem terminology for the book, because I wanted to just take our attention from the word hagiography, since it's not a genre, it is a mode of speaking and writing. For the pre-modern literature, there is no distinction between hagiography, historiography, epistolography in many cases, and other genres, so and other forms of writing. So one of the takeaways, I hope, of the book is to take those categories with a grain of salt, and not use hagiography if possible for pre-modern period. It's a term, of course, that's been coined for our convenience, and not an emic term for many of the authors that we are studying. So that was one of the reasons why I refrained from using it in the title. But you're absolutely right that the first two chapters deal with that question extensively, whether that category exists, and whether we should maybe talk about a new category, which I proposed, hagiodiegesis, as an alternative to hagiography. So I think neologisms and those conventional terms for the sake of scholarship are useful in leading us in the direction of new questions and exciting frames of analysis. But I also want to, with this book, to destabilize that category. And of course, other scholars did that in their scholarship before, but wanted to highlight how hagiographic writing versus biblical story versus apocryphal text, these do not make much sense when we talk about the commemorations of the divine past.
Okay, thank you.
It's me thinking out loud. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Just say for the audience, we still have about 15 minutes or so for questions and conversation. As you're thinking of your questions, you can either put them in the Q&A. If you're feeling shy and you don't want to be put on camera, that's fine. I will read your question aloud for you. No shade there, or no judgment there, I should say. I just, while people are thinking, I'll throw out one other, this is a very broad religious studies question for you, Reyhan. I never know what meaning means. And I really don't. I've never have. I've been studying religion like formally for multiple decades, and whenever people talk about meaning for communities, I'm just like, WTF, what does that mean? And so it just caught my, because this has been like this sort of like bugbear of mine for years, it caught my attention when you use this. And I'm not like, this is not it's not a mean question or anything like that. I'm just curious, like, how does one assess meaning in, and like, what do, like, because what I see you doing is actually providing some ways of thinking about what meaning means. So I was just wondering if you could reflect aloud. I'm joining my colleagues in asking you to think out aloud about something. But what do you have to say about meaning?
No, this is great. I hope we can keep thinking out loud for many months and years to come. It's really fun, and you're absolutely right. When I think about it now, I did say that multiple times. Like, Christian saint stories were oriented towards multiple meanings. Like, I can, I used exactly that same sentence probably in multiple places in the book. But you're absolutely right that I don't think I reflected on the meaning of meaning there. I found 5 meanings of text, and so the historiographical meaning, the exhortative meaning of stories, the exegetical meaning of stories, or theological meaning of stories. So I think I came up with 5 categories of meaning that Christian saint stories might have offered to Muslim audiences of these stories. But the way I'm still having difficulty describing the word itself. If you have any suggestions,
Yeah,
I'm
no,
absolutely happy to.
I actually, like, I think that when we have a technical term that's a little bit fuzzy, usually one of the best things we can do is disaggregate it exactly as you did, like to break it apart into the smaller bits that that offers a little bit more precision, or a little, because then when you think about, okay, this is an encomium to this particular place, like this is like we're celebrating this place or whatever, like that's very different from just saying, oh, this has meaning to somebody who like hears the story, right? Like then you're like, oh, well, this has a resonance too, and maybe to cite our other colleague Donovan Schaefer's work, it might also have like elicit a sort of bodily response or an affective response in some way that could resonate and attract certain types of responses that would then lead to other responses and so forth. So this is the kinds of things that I see you doing. I actually think you're really innovative. It's just that like this is a term that like we often end up sort of defaulting to, and you've offered us these other like more precise terms, which I think is really helpful. So this is me actually like praising your,
No, I think now that I think about it, I think, yeah, of course, like meaning has multiple meanings by itself. And with these 5 categories of meaning, I did not at all intend to suggest that the listeners or readers of these texts interpreted them necessarily in these ways every time they saw it. But I think I can maybe maybe rephrase it and say meaning in this context means the suggestion of the author in for how to read and how to approach the text. So it was mostly on the author's part, in my understanding, than my assumption about how it was consumed by the readers and listeners. So not an internalized perception, but a suggestion to how to reach and how to approach the story. That's how I would define meaning for its use in my book.
That's totally fair.
But
Yeah,
what a fun thing to
I want to talk
talk and
about
think
you with
about.
more. Talk about that with you more. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer, a great question and a great answer. And I do think that with many of the texts that you're discussing here, it's not comparable to how we would talk about meaning in our time. If we look at a written text, we have a very complicated new novel by a great novelist, and we say, what's the meaning? Then people say, oh, you get into the intentional fallacy. No, what did the author mean? We don't know. It provokes something different in everyone. But these stories that you work on are a little bit less, I wouldn't say less complex, but I think they're pretty monodirectional. And yeah, whether every member of the audience got it in that way is not clear, but I think most of the time we know that it's going to provide the reader with a model. I mean, once you talk about holiness, it's pretty clear that you are supposed to take that person that the text is about as a holy person. So why was this person holy? Well, the text is telling you that, and that's the meaning. It doesn't tell us exactly how it then functions, how the text functions, but I think the main purpose of most of these texts is clear. Although one factor that we can never really fully exclude is that they also had a great function as entertainment. And that's something which is very hard to capture in our time, because of course these are also very much time-bound aspects, but maybe some of these stories were just also funny for people. No? We think they're all very serious, but they may so also have been funny. No, not necessarily funny, but entertaining and just something you listen to. Maybe in some of your source material, in some of the literary sources, in which storytelling features you've encountered something like that. I don't know, but I don't think the question of the meaning of meaning in your context should necessarily be so complex. So that's why I think you answered it well.
Thank you so much. And yes, the entertainment is such a big question. I could only pass it with, I think, one sentence or a paragraph, I can't remember, in chapter 1, that we should never forget the entertainment value of these stories. But I wish I could do more with that, because again, back to the Anthony story, Anthony tells these parables to his listeners in this very serious frame. The whole text is serious in itself, and I don't know if we should even categorize text as serious and non-serious, but no. for the sake of convenience, it is a serious text. But when Anthony tells these parables, some of the parables are actually very entertaining and funny, and they create these caricatures of a monk or a silly man. So you're absolutely right that the entertainment value is indispensable and very difficult to detangle from the broader fabric of the text. So absolutely great point.
I'm gonna just offer an opportunity for members of the audience to raise their hands, chime in, use the Q&A. As they're thinking, Reyhan, I have a material culture question for you. So some of the cutting edge, this is far from my area of expertise, both temporally and geographically. Some of the cutting edge research on Buddhism in ancient Japan, so we're talking about like 7th, 8th century, has looked at material texts where they're basically scripts for people who are itinerant preachers. And so the text will include a sort of story, but it also includes notes for the person who is the storyteller, saying like, offer an acknowledgement of what's special about the town that you're visiting in this particular place, and make reference to this particular miracle, which is known to have happened just down the road and stuff like that. I imagine the source material you're working with is quite different from these sorts of like, you know, kind of like lecture notes. That's what they are. But do you have any sort of things that you might be able to say about like the materiality of things like that, like lecture notes or other things that people might use to aid them in the telling of stories to others, and like what that tells us about your material?
Yeah, there is very exciting work being done on Islamic manuscripts and their materiality and their use and other social and cultural aspects of them beyond the text that they carry. That was also one of the parts that I had to leave out, but yes, the short answer is yes. Even if I can't remember an example where there are instructions for the preachers, the very materiality of the text shows the text work as a guideline, with its titles, with its marginalia, if anybody wanted to take notes, and certain text and certain words are highlighted. So all of those materiality of text and the parchment or whatever material it was written on is really saying a lot about how these texts were consumed and used and circulated in very performative ways. And Professor Rogema would know more about the recent research about that, but there is very exciting research about approaching manuscripts as social artifacts and not just carriers of text.
Excellent.
And
Thank
I think there is one more. Yeah. Oh no. I think there is time for one more question. Was that a question, Professor Rogema?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, that's nice. How shall I phrase my question now that we're talking about meanings and things? I wanted to ask you again something about terminology, about the way we describe things. Your book made me think a little bit about this book. I don't know if you know this one, Migrating Tales, by Richard Kalman. The Talmud's narratives and their historical context, and I thought it was funny because it's also in the same series. This author, this scholar, has tried really hard to see how stories in the Talmud can be kind of traced to their origin, how they've traveled, how they've maybe gone from the East Roman world to the Babylonian world, or whether they should be really labeled as Persian, because a lot of the Talmud, of course, has a Persian influence. Maybe he feels that pressure from the field now to categorize it as East or West, etc. So it's not exactly your approach, but I was thinking about the title. If we think about stories that travel from area to area and acquire new meanings in new settings, new communities, these days, I think this scholar and many others fall also, now I'm already expressing a judgment. I don't actually want to judge it. I don't want to say they fall trap to something. They use a language where it sounds as though the tale has a will of its own, right? The tale wants to migrate and takes its suitcases and goes somewhere else. And we know that they don't take their suitcases. It's somebody else who transmits. On the other hand, you can also think that it almost becomes a world in its own, in which the people who tell the tales are only like aids to its transmission. It's almost like an animal that comes to life, you know? So I was wondering whether you've thought about this at all while you were writing. Can you actually say that the tale is moving on its own, or is that kind of overstating the case? It's a bit of a silly question, but I wonder to what extent this is useful to speak in this way.
No, I think you're right that I think this is a new language that we have adapted. The migrating stories, migrating saints, traveling saints, and I used that in a couple talks that I gave, but I didn't use that language in the book at all, because you are right that even though it sounds interesting, it has a certain set of connotations that I didn't want to bring to the fore here, because I agree with you that I also didn't want to think about stories as traveling on their own, and then people catalyzing that travel and by narrating these stories. So I wanted to focus on the agents and transmitters and storytellers as the ones who are doing the work, and the story being just a medium or a technology. But yeah, I think it makes the traveling story or the traveling hero or the traveling migrating stories make a good. It sounds really good, but it wasn't my approach. Yeah, what do you think about it? I mean, you already said what you thought about it, but would you use that terminology?
Well, I just think we always have to at least consider the human agency when we talk about the narration of stories. In 99% of the cases, I think people just tell the story. They may not even be aware of the fact that they're changing it. It's like when you hear a great joke and the next day you want to tell it and you leave out the essential part and nobody's laughing and you don't even realize that you left out the essential part. No? Like the punchline suddenly gone or different. And but yeah, in other cases, of course, there's somebody there who has the explicit will to change something in the story. And if we assume too much this kind of language of things just moving on their own, then we might forget about this. So that's why I would also, in a book like yours, I would be hesitant to use it. I think I was once invited to a conference that also had the name Migrating Tales. And then I used, in my own paper, I used it. And later I thought, yeah, but these texts didn't have legs. And yeah, it's not a huge problem, but I did think about whether this is correct or not.
Well,
so yeah, my last question, just before it's time, what is next?
Oh, thank you so much.
The book about material, the material aspects, maybe.
Hopefully, since now I'm working on rural Christianities and mostly focusing on material culture, I would love to bring back some of the storytelling aspect and how material culture is, in many cases, a great catalyzer of cultural transmission. So I would like to return to stories through the eyes of architectural decorations, inscriptions, and other forms of materiality. But the next book will be about rural Christianities in the medieval Middle East. The storytelling will be only a part of the broader question, and the question in that is to what extent we can speak about a doctrinal form of Christianity in the rural regions, and whether we can talk about religion and non-religion and how to talk about different modes of religion, especially in rural contexts. And I'm really excited to embark on that project.
Yeah. Great.
Well, yes,
that will become a nice sequel.
Definitely.
I hope so. I hope so.
And a good story has a sequel for sure. Reyhan, thank you very much for giving us installment 1 in your multi-part series of scholarly production. Barbara Rogema, thank you so much for your comments today. I also want to thank all the members of the audience who attended and those who asked questions. We have recorded this, and we will hopefully be sharing the recording later. So for those of you who can't get enough of Stories Between Christianity and Islam, first of all, buy the book. And secondly, you can come back and find it on our department YouTube page or website. So I just want to say thank you again, and congratulations to you, Reyhan, for a wonderful book. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Julian, for organizing this, and thank you so much, Dr. Rogema, for being here today. It means a lot to me.
Well, you're welcome, because for me it was a great joy to talk to you all, and nice to get to know you a little bit.
Excellent.
Thank you.